So, Crystal, I thought we'd just kind of summarize our chat with talking about you first, and then your book, and then of course your appearance at the National Book Festival. And so, my first question is a two-part question, but it may be the result in the same answer. And I'd love to know, where do you live and where do you call home?
I live in Lexington, Kentucky, um, and Indian Creek, Kentucky is where I call home.
And that's what I was hoping to get at. So, I just, in full disclosure, I was born at Fort Campbell, Kentucky,
Ah,
and spent some time in a previous job working in the Ashland area on the eastern side of the state. So, I'd love to know where Indian Creek, Kentucky is located.
Indian Creek is more in the foothills, right?
Okay.
It's in the Appalachian,
Uh-huh.
but it's not the mountains proper. It's the foothills of Appalachia, and one of the things I'm always talking about is that I remember this from fifth grade Kentucky history that the county that I'm from is the only county in the Knobs geographical region that's fully in the Knobs region.
Hmm.
So it's actually not geographically in the Appalachian region, but it is part of the Appalachian Regional Council's definition, and it's in the foothills of the mountains. So
Exactly. It's kind of leading up to and leading into the mountains, right?
yeah, yeah.
Well, and then so I was an army brat, which is why I was born in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and then we moved to where my parents were originally from, which is West Virginia. So I grew up in Appalachia as well. Now,
Ah,
now I live in Maryland, and so that's the reason why I always ask that question about where do you live and where do you call home? Because for some people that the answer is the same, but for some it's not. Where you're
yeah.
currently living is not where you call home. So, tell me what it was like growing up in Indian Creek, Kentucky.
Well, I always say I had a enchanted childhood. I was grandparent raised and sort of a spoiled brat in that way. By the time I came along, all of the sort of hard days that my aunts and uncles went through were sort of over. So um, I had the luxury of doing farm work or not. That was they had no choice, but I could milk the cows or not, or I could go help, fetch the water from the well or not. But what I loved to do was cook. That's the one um, duty and chore that I loved doing and did. So oh, I think one of the most wonderful things about growing up there was the flora and the fauna and the natural landscape and having the ability to roam that landscape and as a child pretend and use my imagination while I was doing it and sort of having that wild abandon and that freedom to roam the knobs and hills and go visit the animals whenever I wanted to play in the creek and all of that. So
And I love that you defined, you said you had a love of cooking, but you also defined it as a duty and a chore. So sometimes we don't always think of one and the same. So so how did you develop that? Why do you think you developed that love of cooking?
I think I had it from the very beginning, and probably, that whole idea again about being spoiled. I didn't have to do it, but
Mm,
it's the one thing that I love doing with my grandmother. I say it was a chore because, for during my grandmother's time and for her, I mean, she had to cook
hmm.
every day for the family. I often think about and write about it in Praisesong how many like holiday meals she prepared. She got married at 14. She was 78, I believe, when she died. So the idea of preparing, 60 some odd big holiday dinners is always daunting to think about for me. But it was a necessity. Maybe it wasn't a chore, it was a necessity.
Sure.
Everybody had to eat, and you wanted to eat well. Um, And so I just enjoyed uh, cooking, and I enjoyed that sort of connection that I knew that we could go. And sometimes it was sometimes it was an objection with my family, because I was always like the weird imaginative child. So I would sit at the table and say to my grandparents, like, you're eating, like if we were eating eggs, which there's a whole chapter about eggs in my uh, relationship with eggs. But I would say, you're eating Henny Penny's babies. I would say that to my grandparents, and they would kind of just
Mm.
oblige my imagination and my wildness. So they would just say, okay, honey, yeah, eat your breakfast. Um, but yeah, I love to cook. That's one of my earliest memories is standing up on a chair beside my grandmother, like over the stove,
Mm.
trying to peep into that was important to me, to be able to stand up there and peep into the pots, not just to watch her from my level, but to be able to stand on something so that I could see what she was seeing and peep over into the pots.
You wanted to see the magic.
Yeah, I did.
And obviously, in addition to your love of cooking, where and how did you develop a love of writing?
Um, I mean, I think it's sort of connected, right? A writer that I loved, Ernest Gaines, always said that when he when he imagined a kitchen, like in his novels or his short stories or his essays, he imagined the kitchen that he grew up in when his auntie was raising him. And so I think for me, a lot of that was connected to those early days of having that sort of wild freedom. My grandparents would just about anywhere in our holler. Um, I never felt lost or felt afraid. So anywhere I was, whether it was at the creek or across in the field or, up one of the hills or the others, or swimming in the creek or trying to catch minnows or pennywinkles or whatever I was catching, I was within range of a good yell from our front stoop. My grandfather would say, Chrissy, where are you? And so I think having that freedom to roam was part of what fostered my love of writing, that being able to fuel the imagination. And the other part was that my grandmother always wanted to be a school teacher,
Mm.
and she was never able to. So I was sort of her student. So she started reading to me when I was really young, and I learned how to read long before I ever went to, I began with Head Start and the Head Start program, but I knew how to read before then. So by the time I went to school, I was already reading on a third grade level.
Mm.
And so, and that's why I graduated from high school when I was 16. But that love of reading fostered the love of writing. My grandmother always said that after I had read all the books in the house, I started writing my own. And so, and in some ways that's true, because I can remember like making up stories and telling her what my stories were, and she wrote them down. And then once I learned how to write, I started writing them myself, like bad rhyming poems and all kinds of stuff. So um, it was fostered early. I didn't really know what it meant to become a writer.
Mm.
And my family didn't know, because like I said, my grandmother had an eighth grade education. My grandfather had only went to the third grade, and he couldn't really read. Um, and I was painfully shy. So I remember when I got ready to graduate from high school, and not many people at that time, a few cousins, but nobody had gone to college. And so I remember being painfully shy, sitting in the counselor's office with my grandparents, and the counselor saying, well, what does she want to be? And my grandmother said, well, she likes to write awfully well. And the counselor said, well, I'm going to put down journalism. And they looked at me and I just shook my head, yes. And that's what I ended up majoring in, which wasn't the imaginative writing that I really wanted, but I didn't even know how to verbalize that. I didn't know any writers. And I also at that time there were no books. The closest I got to seeing myself in a book was Where the Red Fern Grows. And that was because of the rural landscape. And so I could relate to that. But at that time, I wasn't aware of any Black writers or Black books until I went to college.
And like, so when you went to college, I mean, obviously you've gone on to become the Poet Laureate for the state of Kentucky, Commonwealth of Kentucky for a couple of years. And
Mm-hmm.
so when did you realize that it is something that that can be an occupation, it can be a profession?
I think it was post college, right? Because I was writing all along. And certainly the idea of being a writer and what that meant and not really knowing did not stop me from writing. I mean, I think the writing gene, I feel like I was born with that. Like that's one of my, I was put here to do that in some form. And it just took me a while to figure out what form that should take because, journalism. And then I ended up working in public relations for a number of years. And even when I was working in public relations, I would take my lunch hours and go to the library to work on short stories and poems. And, after my children had gone to sleep, I would work on short stories and poems. And so it wasn't until sort of mid-career in my public relations career where I was like, oh, um, and then, my levels of success. So I thought I had a few little poems published here and there. And I thought, well, if I could get a short story published in a magazine I've heard of, then that was my bar. That's all I wanted. One short story published in a magazine that I thought was a noted magazine, something that I had heard of. Uh, and then I was like, oh, well, I did that. So maybe, what if I wrote a book? And, and it's not that I didn't work hard, but I think there was a certain level of, because I didn't major initially in English or follow, I took all the classes I could that were in creative writing, but um, I sort of saw it on the side until I didn't. And getting those publications sort of one at a time before they were all sort of stacked upon each other to make a book, did I realize that being a writer was possible and writing the kind of writing that I wanted to do. And it was writers like Gail Jones, who's from Kentucky, Wendell Berry, who's become a good friend, and Bobby Ann Mason, who's also a friend in that sort of close-knit Kentucky writing community. Once I began to meet them and see the possibilities, then I became really encouraged. And, Ernest Gaines gave me permission to write about rural characters. Gail Jones gave me permission to write about rural Black women characters. And then to see and get to know Wendell Berry and Wendell and Tanya and Bobby Ann and the sort of cachet of well-known writers that we have here. And to not really know at the beginning who they were. Probably if I knew who they were, I would have been too shy even or too daunted or too starstruck to get to know them the way that I have. So that's been a blessing. The Kentucky writer's landscape has always been really rich and nurturing.
Mm, that's awesome to hear. Yeah. And like you imagine, I love words, and so I love the selection of the words you use for the title of the book, and so I wanted to dissect that a little bit. So obviously,
Mm-hmm.
praise song for the kitchen ghost. I never heard of the term kitchen ghost before, so it was new to me. Uh how would you define what that means?
Um, to me, and I know everybody thinks about, you say ghosts and everybody's like, oh,
Hmm.
haunted, spooky. And it was sort of a haunting, but not in a bad way. I was thinking about the ancestors and how they serve us from beyond. And it had everything to do from that. The word kitchen ghost came to me after my grandmother died, and I never thought it was going to be anything that I would write about. She died, and that first holiday, we were all trying to figure out, well, what do we,
Hmm.
one, we're in deep grief, but how do we carry this forward? Are we going to carry this forward? Because there was 20, 25 grandchildren, 7 children that would all gather, down home in that little house. And so nobody wanted to get together. So we all decided we would be separate. And even though I'd helped my grandmother for years, I started cooking here in my own little kitchen, same little kitchen you see behind me. And I just didn't think I could do it. Like I was crying and I was breaking down, and I was just cooking for me and my 3 children and my mother. Everybody had sort of broken off into their own little units, and I was trying to make all the tradition and really cooking too much because my grandmother cooked for 40 people, so I was trying to cook for 40 people too because that's the only way I knew how to do it. And I remembered I had her dress hanging up, and I went back in the bedroom and got her dress and brought it in here and hung it up on the back door over here. And I suddenly like was okay. Like I could hear her saying, "Okay, girl, come on, let's get this, let's do this. You can do it. More sage. Not too much this or that." And I just felt really guided and uplifted by her. And that was when the term came to me. And I thought, there are times in a writer's life where you think, well, okay, this is extremely important, or this is extremely private, and it's not going to enter my writing because it's something I want to keep for myself. It's not going to enter the world of my writing. And for many, many years, it didn't. And then it slowly slipped into a poem, and then it's slipped into a short story. And the idea of the kitchen ghost were also present in my novel, The Birds of Opulence. Um, And then when I was commissioned to write this essay with the Merchants Magazine, we kind of went back and forth with what to call it. And the editor was saying the same thing. She was like, well, ghost, do you want to say praise song for the ancestors, or, you know, praise song for my grandmother? And do we want to use the word praise song because that has religious connotations? And we kind of went back and forth. And I think even more than the content of the essay, we went round and around about should praise song be one word? It should be 2 words, actually. And we went back and forth. And I finally, you have to choose your battles, as you know,
Hmm.
when you're a writer and you're working
Hmm.
with editors. And that was a battle that I chose to fight because it resonated with me so deeply because of that initial experience. And so she said, okay, well, praise song 2 words. And I said, well, okay. Praise song 2 words. And then she let me keep the kitchen ghost. And I hadn't even thought about turning it into a longer work until my friend Ronnie Lundy, who is a chef and well-known food writer about Appalachia, called, and she said, well, I just love this essay. And would you ever think about turning that essay into a culinary memoir? And I said, no, I'm working on a novel. I don't want to do that. And she said, well, just think about it, and I'll introduce you to my food agent. And, the rest is history about how that came along. But even when I was working with Frances, after they had bought the book, uh, that was the first thing I said to him, like, are we going to be able to keep this title? He said, oh, there is no other title. Absolutely, we're going to keep this title. And so I think sometimes the universe speaks and continues to speak around a title. And I think that this was long ago destined for this to be the title of a work around this subject, even
Yeah,
if I didn't know it at the time.
yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. I can't imagine it being titled anything else. You know, like the other words that you and the other editor had thrown out, ancestor and grandmother. I just think this title resonates so much more, and just more, more connection and more power behind it all. And so, and you already kind of alluded to the religious kind of connection to the word praise song, but I'd love to learn, because it's not, other than maybe in some churches, it's not a word that we use in our lexicon very much. And so I'd love to hear a little bit from you about why that also was part of the importance for you to keep it in the title.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in much of my work, when I'm writing about Kentucky, when I'm writing about Appalachia, uh, part of what I'm doing is to, uh, not on the front end, but it's always in the back of my mind. If I can be a little bit more long-winded, it's always in the back of my mind that this is an opportunity um, to showcase a part of the culture that people don't readily recognize. Meaning that with my other books, often when I travel, people would say things like, "Oh, or there's Black people in Appalachia," and then they would move into some of the Appalachian stereotypes. But part of what I think I'm put here to do is to shine a light on my people. And we lived in the hills and the mountains for since the early 1800s, my family. And so I think that I don't claim to be a historian, even though I've dedicated to doing a massive amount of research for this book. um, I think it's important for this book to be in the conversation about who Appalachians are, what Kentucky is, and that it's this sort of melting pot that the rest of the country doesn't often know, like the invisibility of the Black Appalachian has been astounding, I think, for years. Like even in the definition, um, sometimes when you look in an old dictionary, it'll say who are Appalachians, and it'll say white people indigenous to the Appalachian region or something like that. It's just astounding that
Mhm.
Black people and people of color have. So in that way, I'm thinking that it's a continuous, that even my body of work is a continuous praise song to the ancestors, and not just my family, but people like my family who were here and are here and will always be here in Kentucky, and call Kentucky and Appalachia home. So in
Yeah.
that way, I was thinking of praise song. And I can't be from this family with all of these ministers without thinking about, even though I don't really consider myself a religious person anymore, I very much grew up in that tradition, which is also, a part of the conversation about how religion plays a role in Appalachian lives. So that word praise song is sort of doing double duty,
Mhm.
I think.
Yeah. And um when you talk about, it's obviously part memoir and part cookbook. Why the combination versus going one way, or all in one way or all in the other?
Well, part of this is because if I had had my druthers, and I don't know if it would have been as successful. Francis knows what he's doing, and I trusted him. the marketing team, all of the people at Penguin have been really wonderful. I don't consider, because of Ronnie and all of these, people like Michael Twitty and all of those people who are chefs or who are trained food writers in some ways. I never wanted to write a cookbook. That was never the plan. I wanted to write a food-based memoir with no recipes. And Francis wasn't really having that. He was saying, and what I wanted to do initially was to, part of my tradition is oral, right? So my grandmother would sort of tell me these stories, and my initial intention was to have, tell me these recipes, and my initial intention was to have all the recipes sort of in her voice, in a colloquial way, inside the chapters, with no sort of translation of them into sort of like these things that are more traditional cookbook looks, like the actual photographs. And we ended up hiring a food tester and all of that to make sure that they were cookable, which I finally agreed to. And I think it's a wonderful combination, because it brings in two different audiences. So there are people who read it. It's actually been, I've got some negative feedback both ways, and gotten positive feedback both ways, because some people have said, some people who are connoisseurs of cookbooks have said, oh, it's too many words in here and not enough recipes. Why aren't there more recipes? And then people who read it as a food memoir have said, I wish there had been even more stories. And, how did you choose these particular stories? What about this thread or that thread? Because they wanted less. And so I like the idea that it serves the dual purpose. But I do sort of fight for the idea that it's a culinary memoir. That's what I'm always like, somebody's like, oh, I love your cookbook. And I'm like, thank you. But but it's also a culinary memoir. Or sometimes I'll say it's a culinary memoir, not really a cookbook. So I do think it serves as both.
Yeah, it strikes a good balance, and
Yeah.
as you said, introduces maybe one group of intended buyers to more than they anticipated, and vice versa. So I think that's nice.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think that, part of it is, as a literary writer, I just really, my fiction is really jealous of this book, because this book has been a national bestseller, and none of my novels or my collections of short stories or my poems were national bestsellers. And so my other work is kind of eyeballing this book like,
mhm, mhm.
but I'm very proud of it. So part of that sort of pull in me was like, I don't want to ruin my literary reputation. And I think Francis kind of giggles at me, because he's like, well, national bestseller, you think your reputation's ruined? And I'm like, maybe you're right.
And so pivoting a little bit to obviously your appearance at the upcoming National Book Festival. First, have you ever been to the National Book Festival, and why is it important to be at events like book festivals and doing book tours?
Yeah, I have not ever been to the National Book Festival, so I'm very honored that this book was chosen, uh, and to be there. And I think, at least it's my dream. I was going to say every writer's dream. At least my dream has always been for my book to be a part of the Library of Congress in some kind of sort of official way. And so I think that this is an opportunity for that. And book festivals are always an opportunity to, I was in DC, and my my book tour proper, but I think that book festivals are always an opportunity for writers to meet with readers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and with new readers. So I'm really excited about seeing people who, go to the National Book Festival every year and being a part of all of that, and to sort of have this sort of second. I'm doing a lot of book festivals this fall. So that one hard hitting month when the book came out, this is sort of a part two of that, to do these book festivals. So I think that so many people want their books signed, and there's something, even as a reader, if I put my reader hat on instead of my writer hat on, I'm also excited about meeting the other writers there and getting some of my own books signed to bring back home with me.
That's a good point, right?
Yeah.
Well, and you're absolutely right. Book festivals are great places to discover new books, that may not be on your radar screen. I go to book lectures and author talks, but I had to have known about that author or that book in advance. And whereas in a book festival, you literally might stumble on someone and someone's
Yeah.
work that you wouldn't have otherwise been introduced to. So those are great introductory opportunities as well. I think in the time that I've got left, I got one more question for you, and that's I just wanted to, I think when you talk about Black Appalachian foodways, I've kind of learned a lot about Edna Lewis in Orange, Virginia,
Yeah.
but I would love to know about your take on like the role of food and placemaking in general.
Mm. I mean, I think a couple of things I've discovered while I was on book tour, and this was important too about a book tour, is to really meet people and get their perspectives, because writing is a solitary act, and so is reading is a solitary act, and so to have those two sort of communities come together at things like this and at book signings is important, and you know to have people crying and to talk about their own kitchen ghost, and to say, my Italian nonna is my kitchen ghost, or I'm from Mexico and my kitchen ghost was my abuela. To have people talk about their own uh, individual talk just speaks to how important place and food is, and how it's both universal and it's so very, very specific. Like, I love to get in a good regional food fight, which I start them all the time on social media. So I just started one recently where I posted a meme about sugar in the grits. And of
Mm.
course I can guarantee that there'll be, 200 comments every time you say something about putting sugar in the grits. But it's fun to me to watch people be so adamant.
Mhm.
Even my husband said, well, don't embarrass me like that on on social media. Uh, but it's regional, right? Like, I did grow up with putting sugar and butter in the grits, and putting
Mhm.
sugar and butter in rice, which of course my friends from other regions think, oh my gosh, don't tell anybody that. And I'm like, this is what we did. And or sugar in the cornbread or not. I don't put sugar in the cornbread. I'm a cornmeal purist, but other regions do. And I think I find all of that fascinating, how food and place are connected. And so much of it is, it's not just geographical. Somebody asked me, like, what's the difference in soul food and Appalachian food? And there are lots of sort of crossovers, but part of it has to do with the actual terrain. Like, in the South, for example, you can grow greens. You can have a winter crop of greens in the South, not too far from here. Like, if you go to Georgia, you have a winter crop. You can grow greens into the winter unless there's a big frost or something. But if you lived in the mountains, like, or the hills where we live, like, there was a cutoff. Like, everything was over by August, September. you couldn't grow anything. So preservation was a big part of our culture. Preservation is a big part of Appalachian culture, like
Mhm.
putting everything up, curing the meats, canning, later on freezing when that became a thing, but like preserving so that you have enough, because you're not going to be able to grow any crops, but
Mhm.
preserving so you have enough to last through the winter was important. Like digging a hole and putting those potatoes in, because you can't grow any potatoes in frozen ground, and each region has its own specific way of preparing food and preserving food or not. Like if you live
Mhm.
somewhere where you can get fruit and vegetables and grow fruit and vegetables all year long, you don't worry about preserving. Then there's a um, you can go out and get fresh foods all year long, but you've got to string those green beans and make leather breeches if you want to have green beans come winter, like all of those kinds of things. So all of those are regional too, and those kind of foodways I find fascinating. And there's even more variations when you branch out across the world, like seeing how people uh, preserve food and what their foodways are is very much connected to place. And people are very passionate about it. And that's why people are so passionate about that sugar thing, and that whatever all those fights are. People are so passionate about, this is the only way to prepare this particular dish. um, and the other things that I've noticed is that often the food that people consider their comfort food uh, was the struggle food for the previous generation.
Mm. Mm.
Like, we love beans and cornbread, but I think my ancestors ate beans and cornbread by itself because that's what they had. I mean, were able to preserve those beans and have them dried. And then what do you have in the cabinet? You've got a little bit of cornmeal. You can make hot water cornbread even if you don't have milk, or you can use soured milk, and you can have bread with it to get some nutrients in the body to be able to feed. And then we think about that. Look at chicken and dumplings is one of my favorite meals from Praisesong, and I cook it and eat it all the time, probably too much. But every culture has something that they make with a little bit of thickening, a little bit of broth, a little bit of meat, to get the belly full. And so that's our comfort foods. Those were struggle foods for our ancestors.